Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Tommy Hughes, and I'm going to be moderating our panel discussion today. Before we start, I want to thank Fix the Debt and the Murphy Institute, who are co-hosting this event. And I want to express my appreciation to both of them for their focus on an issue which is so vitally important to all of us. Our format for today is first, we're going to hear a brief presentation from each of our three panelists as to why this issue is important, and then we're going to have a panel discussion which I'll moderate, and then we're going to allow some time, about 10 or 15 minutes, for questions from the audience. I want to mention that I do teach at Tulane Law School as an adjunct faculty member, and in my class, when people don't really participate in the class discussion, I call on people, but I promise you I won't do that here today. And in fact, what I usually do is I call on people whose names I know, and when I tell everybody that, everybody I know bolts for the exit. So I know a bunch of you, and I don't want to see anybody run out today early. Before we get started, I want to introduce our three esteemed panelists. To my immediate left is Steve Sheffrin. He is a professor of economics and the director of the Murphy Institute here at Tulane. Steve has a PhD in economics from MIT, and he has written over 10 books and 100 articles on in the field of macroeconomics, public finance, and international economics. To Steve's left is Paul Stebbins. Paul is the CEO and executive chairman of World Fuel Services Corporation. He has been involved in Fix the Debt from its early stages. He is a member of the Business Roundtable and received a degree in government from Georgetown. To my far left is Bill Gale. Bill is the chair of the Federal Economic Policy at the Brookings Institute. He was a senior economist for the Council of Economic Advisors under the first President Bush. He has served on the advisory board of the Government Accountability Office, and he received a PhD from Stanford. I also want to mention Todd McCracken, who is president of the National Business Association, was scheduled to come here, but at the last minute he had something come up and was not able to make it, but I'm sure we're going to cover a lot of ground even without Todd here. So at this point, I want to turn the floor over to Steve, who's going to make some opening remarks, and then we will move on to our other panelists.
Well, thank you very much, Tommy. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased to be joining my esteemed colleagues on the panel. I want everyone to think of an old, beautiful mansion in New Orleans that you just inherited from your elderly aunt. And it was a beautiful mansion on St. Charles Avenue, but it had a little bit of structural damage, and you were sure there were termites. And so you were working on it and trying to fix it up, and all of a sudden a grease fire broke out in the kitchen. And so you ran around, because if you realized you didn't put that grease fire out, the whole mansion would burn down. And you called everyone, and finally the fire trucks came, and the grease fire went out. And then you forgot about things for a while, but of course the termites were still there, and the structural damage is still there. And then moreover, there's a can of grease still lying in the kitchen. And that's the way I feel about the episode in the last week or so. Of course, the grease fire was our debt ceiling, and the structural damage and the termites really are a long-term debt problem. And while we obviously focus attention on putting out that grease fire, and we may have another grease fire in the future, it's important that we don't lose track of the termites, because that'll ultimately bring us down. I want to take a few minutes just to talk about sort of the history of the debt ceiling, because we just went through this. We're all kind of exhausted by watching it. But I want to suggest that debates about debt ceilings, and this has been part of our culture for a long time. The debt ceiling actually started out in 1917, because before then, whenever Congress wanted to issue any debt, they had to approve each bond on a vote. So by having a single debt ceiling, it was actually a governmental reform. We voted on the debt ceiling in Congress about 100 times. From 1978, we raised it 53 times. About half of those were very clean debt ceilings, nothing attached to them. But the other half were tied up with budget matters. In some cases, they precipitated budget discussions. In other cases, they just accompanied budget discussions. But historically, many of our big budget reforms or budget actions, like in 1990, the Graham-Rudman in '85, the various budgets under Clinton, and even more recently, were tied up with debt measures. Now, a number of people would say, why in the world would you ever have a debt ceiling? Because after all, you've decided on your spending levels and tax levels already. That, of course, makes perfect economic and logic. But, of course, the American system has a lot of checks and balances, and I think a lot of people view the debt ceiling as something that's a check and balance. But, of course, it's not supposed to bring the country down and not supposed to cause ruin. So what was different this time? Well, I think this time, probably for the first time, the challenges about the debt ceiling, the fight about it, were initially tied up with something that had nothing to do with debt. It had to do with health care and with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And plus, as I'm sure we'll discuss today, the politics of our politics is different today for many different reasons than it was even 4 or 5 years ago. Well, I think Bill will talk a little bit about what the settlement was and what's in the future. I just want to finish up with two things. One, I just want to mention that if you want a kind of a long-run view about what the problems were and why this is a serious issue, in September, this Congressional Budget Office put out their long-term forecast. And they basically said today the ratio of debt to GDP is about 73%. For the next 10 years, they forecast it roughly to be the same. But by 2038, so 25 years from now, it's getting to the point where it's completely unsustainable. And if it's unsustainable, of course, we know that it can't be sustained and something's going to have to give. And that's the problem that we're going to face. The fights we had now about the debt ceiling could easily lead into much bigger fights if we don't get a handle on things. And I want to just give you the 4 bad things that could happen, and then maybe I'll turn to Paul for some optimism here. But the bad things that could happen is, of course, we could end up in a situation where people simply do not believe the faith and credit of the U.S. government, and you have a situation like Greece, where people don't want to hold the U.S. debt, interest rates skyrocket, and so forth. And if I don't think that will happen, but if we had a series of incidents like we just had, we could easily get down that path. The second way is more subtle. We don't actually default on the debt or even threaten default. We just end up having lots of inflation. And although I may be a minority on this issue, I'm a little concerned that the Fed's programs are so big in terms of buying new government debt. They're essentially buying 3/4 of all the new government debt that is being issued this year with their QE3, with their monetary policy. And we know that in the long run, that can't be sustained. We can't keep monetizing and what economists call monetizing the debt without getting a lot of inflation. And so that's a worry. And that, again, is one of these things that could creep up on you. Those of us who lived through the 70s, remember in the beginning there was not a problem. By the end, we were petrified about inflation. Another problem that could occur is even harder, is more like a termite problem. As more debt's out there, there's less people hold the debt. They don't invest in stocks and bonds. We don't do enough investing, and our growth becomes a lot less. And finally, with all that debt out there, if we do have another financial crisis like we had in 2007, there's going to be a real reluctance to engage in kind of any activist policy because people will say, how could you do any more because there's so much debt out there? And that inability to respond to crises could be a real problem. So with that, I'll turn to my next panelist.
Only 4? Okay, so I'm the good news, and then I don't have too much other good news, is that I'm a government major, actually got a job. So for those of you who are still wondering what you're going to do when you get out of school, there's hope. So I'm the business guy here, and I think probably the way to approach this is, so how to get involved, why to get involved, why do I see the issue as being an important one for all of you. And then third, if I was anybody in this room who was under 30, I'd be really pissed off at our generation because we have left you one hell of a mess. You know, this is a tsunami bell ringing in the Pacific, and the wave is about to hit Thailand. I mean, the $17 trillion is a number that's sort of hard to get your head around. I mean, you know, think about $1 a second for 540,000 years. Just think about that for a minute. $1 a second for 540,000 years, and you get our national debt. And it's growing, and we're all very happy that it's, the deficit this year is going to be 600 billion. It's not going to be the trillion that we've been running the last 4 years. But the history of the debt is pretty interesting. I mean, the highest point of the debt to our GDP in history was after World War II at about 108%. The historical average is around 40% debt to GDP. In 2007, it was 37% debt to GDP, and we're currently at 73%. And at the current trajectory, in the next decade or two, we will be very close to 100% of debt to GDP. Now, to my colleague's point about how does this compare with all the stuff you've read about Greece, that'll never be us. Well, Greece is 159% debt to GDP, but Spain is 84%. We're not that far off of Spain. So before we get all, happy, the difference is that we're 24% of the world's GDP. So we're the flywheel of the global economy, and the rest of the world is watching us in utter bewilderment at this amazing amount of dysfunction that you're seeing in Washington that is our governing process right now. So to call it governing would be generous. And I think that the issue is that you've got kind of a longer-term trajectory that is very threatening. The big drivers are, of course, the 68% of the budget, which is not discretionary. That's the health care, that's the Social Security, the Medicare, the Medicaid. And then you've got the interest on the debt, and we're going to hear probably a little bit more about that from Bill. But the interest on the debt, in 2013 is going to be $230 billion, right? And that's in the lowest interest rate environment we've had in I don't know how long, right? So if interest rates go back to anything resembling normal and you get back to 5% interest rates, your interest on that national debt that we're paying on an annual basis becomes $900 billion a year. Our defense budget's 750, right? The next 15 largest defense budgets in the world in aggregate are 550. That includes Russia and China, right? If you look at the interest on the debt and you add up the combined budgets of interior, education, Homeland Security, the Justice Department, state, add them all together outside of defense, and you're not even close to what we're paying on the interest. And that's in a low interest rate environment. So just to put that in some perspective, if the interest rates move by 1%, it eats up everything that we just were so proud of ourselves, that all the people said that we saved all this money by having the sequester, which was the stupidest exercise in public policy we've had in a long time because it was just a broad axe across the spectrum. But even if you move it by 1 percentage point, you've eaten up everything that we thought we saved, right? Now, the reason we did that is because we couldn't get to the real drivers. We couldn't do the hard work of getting in the room to have the conversation about the harder long-term issues, which we all share as a country. Now, a lot of people say, how did we get here? It's been a long time. Everybody owns it. Nobody gets a free pass, certainly not business. We were asleep at the wheel. I can tell you as a member of the Business Roundtable, we're all flying around the world on our airplanes going to our global offices, and we weren't thinking about what was going on in D.C. until August of 2011. And when we almost defaulted at that time, that was a wake-up call for the business community. We've all been busy with our K Street lobbyists, taking care of our tax, exemptions and all that stuff. But you wake up one day and realize that there's nobody governing, right? There's nobody running the thing, and we're about to put the most important political experiment in history is being put at risk because of a lack of governance. Well, how do you stand back and just watch that happen? So I'd say that I speak for a lot of the business community that said, we were part of that problem too. We were not paying attention. We were not engaged in the issue. So we made an effort to get more knowledgeable about the issue. Dave Cody from Honeywell sat on the Bowles-Simpson Commission. That was a real wake-up call. That's scary stuff. That $17 trillion number is real and getting bigger. So there's a sense of urgency now that this is not about the partisanship. It's about citizenship. It's not about whether I'm Republican, Democrat, or Independent. It's about what my role is as a citizen of this country. And it's not about advocacy. It's about governance. And we haven't had that. And I would say that one of the root cause issues of all this political dysfunction is the deeper issues of gerrymandering, political districting, how that all works. Why is it so hard to get to yes? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. On that cheery note, Bill?
All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be out in Washington, D.C., and here in New Orleans. D.C. is sometimes a very heady place to be, and sometimes it's a miserable place to be. And the last 2 weeks have been pretty miserable. I want to talk about two topics, the debt ceiling and the longer-term debt problem. And I specifically call them topics rather than issues because the debt ceiling is not or should not be an issue. I'll come back to that in a second. But it's what everyone's talking about. The long-term debt problem should be an issue, but nobody's talking about it. So let me just say, I don't blame you if you are totally confused about all of this. The experts understand it, but then that gets translated from the experts to other people via the media, and the media, by and large, don't understand it, or they're not interested in understanding it. They're interested in portraying it as a horse race. And so let me start with the debt ceiling and then talk about the long-term debt issue, the long-term debt problem. The way to start with the debt ceiling is to note that the government cannot spend money. It is a felony for the government to spend money unless Congress authorizes the government to spend that money. So forget about Obama and the Republicans. Just think about Congress and the executive part of government. Congress authorizes the executive to spend $100. At the same time, Congress authorizes the executive branch to raise $50 in taxes. Okay? Well, there's an extra $50 there that the executive part of government needs to raise via debt in order to pay for the 100 in spending. In most countries, when the legislature authorizes 100 in spending and 50 in taxes, it implicitly also authorizes 50 in lending, in borrowing that the government can do. So once the legislature tells the government to spend the money, it tells it, yes, you're also authorized to finance that spending, either through taxes or debt. In the U.S., we don't do that. Okay? Congress can authorize the government to spend money, but not authorize the government to borrow the money to pay for that spending. All right? It's totally a historical accident. It's totally illogical. And that's actually what happened. Congress authorized the government to spend a bunch of money, but then they didn't raise the debt ceiling, so the government couldn't actually finance the amount of spending that it had been told to do by the Congress. So that's what this big debate was about, whether Congress would authorize the government to pay for the spending that Congress already authorized the government to undertake. Okay? If that sounds ridiculous and silly and inverted and not logical, I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. So we went through this. Steve mentioned you get this mansion and you're trying to deal with the termites, and a grease fire breaks out. Okay? It's actually worse than that. Okay? It's a group house that got this mansion, and half of the people in the group house set the grease fire. Okay? These are your roommates. Okay? It was a totally manufactured crisis. There's no reason for the government not to authorize the debt needed to pay for the spending that Congress has already authorized. So instead, we went through these 2 weeks. We lost jobs. We hurt the economy. There are stories of kids who were getting cancer treatments who had to stop getting the cancer treatments. There were scientific experiments. You can imagine if you're in labs, you couldn't go into the labs for a couple of weeks, so whatever experiments were going on, if they needed constant maintenance, they basically died out. So a sub-generation of experiments died out. And of course, U.S. standing in the world deteriorated rapidly. A colleague of mine was in Mexico talking about at a conference on governance, and he said he was basically laughed out of the room. You know, what can we possibly learn from you guys? You can't keep your government open. So we went through this incredibly expensive experience with no particular gain. We just got back to where we were supposed to be. The government's back open. The debt ceiling hasn't been raised. It's just been waived until February 7th. And the question is, will anything change in the political stalemate? I actually think they will. I think that, we can talk about this later, but I think the moderates in the Republican Party learned that they cannot follow the Tea Partiers in this particular episode or on this particular issue. And so we'll find out in January, February when these things come back up again. But I'm actually optimistic that although there were lots of costs, that those costs weren't a total waste, that maybe things will change the next time around. We'll see. The thing I want to emphasize, though, is the debt ceiling has nothing to do with the long-term fiscal issues, with the debt burdens that we're talking about earlier. Even if we did not have a debt ceiling, even if we were like other countries and just said, if we authorize the government to spend $100, then we're authorizing them to finance $100 either through taxes or debt. Even if we did that, even if we abolished the debt ceiling, we would still need to have this conversation about long-term fiscal situation. Basically, what's happening is our public debt is rising relative to the size of the economy. That's a problem for the economy. The easiest way to understand it is if your credit card debt is rising relative to your income and you're increasingly paying larger and larger bills every month, or as Paul mentioned, you're paying increased interest on your credit card, so you're getting caught in this credit card cycle. That's bad because it crowds out all the productive other things you could be doing with your funds. And the same thing is true at the economy-wide level. If we're borrowing money, we're sucking it away from the private sector. If government payments are going to interest payments, they're not going to something else, either educations or highways or whatever. And these things, over time, as Steve mentioned, they're like termites in the woodwork. They're not big, grabby headline events. They're just gradual decay, gradual eating away at the amount of resources we have to invest. And so they're a problem precisely because there's no specific deadline. There's no drop-dead date. It's just a slow, gradual sucking away of capital from the private sector into government debt. I will just mention a couple of things about this. One is that people want to claim victory now because it looks like our debt to GDP ratio has plateaued. That's going to stay roughly constant over the next 10 years. What they're forgetting is that it doubled in the last 5 years. So all these warnings that people gave about the debt 5, 10 years ago, about all the bad things that could happen, they've now happened. I mean, when you ask people what they would worry about, it would be a doubling of the debt relative to the size of the economy and the increased impact, negative impact, draining impact that has on the long-term economy. So I think I'll stop there, and there's certainly a lot to talk about, but the thing I want to emphasize from both a political and an economic standpoint is that the debt ceiling debates have nothing to do with the long-term debt issues that we are here to talk about. It's a sheer coincidence that we had this big debt ceiling lift in the last 24 hours.
Okay, thank you for those presentations. I'm going to direct the first question among the panelists to Steve. The national debt seems like some type of abstract issue to a lot of average Americans. Can you explain why that sentiment is wrong and what's wrong with accumulating a lot of debt from the practical viewpoint of an average American?
I think the best way to maybe think about this is that we're on a course where you're spending, I go back to Bill's example of the household, and I think the analogy is there. You're spending a lot more than you're taking in. You're running up your credit card. But in this case, you're not going to pay off the credit card. You're going to give the credit card, you're going to give the bills to your children. And then your children are going to inherit that. And at some point, they're obviously not going to pay, and they're going to either go into bankruptcy or make some other adjustment. So what we're essentially doing is we're shifting the burden of our spending policies and our decisions today to future generations. And it's not that future, right? It's not that much future. So people in college today will be experiencing this right in the middle of their peak earning times. And it could be even sooner than that. There's a lot of other events. All these forecasts that the Congressional Budget Office puts out all assume there's no major financial crisis, no major recessions, and so forth. So literally within the next, next 20 years or so, all of a sudden the bills and all the turmoil is coming due. And to try to fix things at that time is much more difficult. If you begin to fix things today and do little things, the power of compound interest will work in your favor. If you wait a little bit, the power of compound interest works against you. And so, are there going to be Social Security benefits? Are we going to be providing the same type of health care as before? How are we funding the other parts of the government? And so forth. Those are the meaningful things that are going to happen. And if you put them at that level, you know, will your parents be getting paid their Social Security? Will you expect to get Social Security? Will you expect to get Medicare when you get it? If there's uncertainty about that, that's going to have a big impact on you. And things can happen, of course, faster than that. As you anticipate that, then, of course, things can accelerate. So I think it's very real, although you may not see it. It's at some point the termites eat away enough, and the thing does collapse.
Paul or Bill, either of you want to add on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, look at the basic math. I mean, it's a demographic issue, and I think one of the things that got me interested in the issue was, you know, you hear Erskine Bowles saying, look, when Franklin Roosevelt started talking about Social Security, the average, you know, the eligibility was age 65, but life expectancy was 63. He was a pretty smart politician. He figured everybody'd be dead. He'd never apply for it. But, you know, we live in a different world now, and that baby boom generation is coming alive, and the math is real, and it is displacing a lot of other sort of economic productivity. As a business people, you know, we're often attacked by the progressives for being, you know, you guys are all sitting on cash and you should be investing, and why aren't we growing? Well, you know, at 1.8 or 2% GDP growth, you know, you're treading water, and there's a sense of, I don't know my cost of capital. You know, I don't know what the tax policy is going to be. We live in this sort of lurching from crisis to crisis. There's all this uncertainty around it that makes it very difficult to plan. And long-term planning is what makes the economy grow, right? So all of this issue about displacing, you're competing with your federal government for capital. The interest rates are an unknown. There is no functional long-term sort of industrial policy. All that stuff has a very real impact every single day on lives, hiring, firing, you know, employment, what have you.
Bill, anything you want to add?
Yeah, it's easy to talk about this as kind of a Wall Street issue. It's kind of a, this is what will happen to financial markets, and you'll crowd out investment and so on. And I think your question is a good one, because this actually is a Main Street issue. This is an issue that will affect people in their daily lives. The chain of connections basically is the government borrows a lot, that crowds out investment from the private sector. That reduces the amount of capital workers have, either, you know, computers per worker or machine per worker. That reduces the wages of future generations. So that's what we mean when we talk about mortgaging your future. It's kind of a double whammy. Wages will be lower, income will be lower than it otherwise would be, and the debt will be higher. So there'll be a higher burden of paying off the debt. So in very concrete terms, the available after-tax income will go down relative to what it otherwise would have been. And it's, like Steve said, it's hard, it's kind of an invisible effect. You know, but that doesn't mean it's not real. I mean, if you walk by some building that's collapsed in a heap of rubble, you know, you very clearly you can say that earthquake that happened last week caused the building to collapse. But if you walk by an empty lot, it's not natural to think, oh, the government crowded out investment, and so there never was a building built there to begin with, right? But that's the type of effects we're talking about. They're very real. There's no economic model in the world, as far as I know, that will tell you that high and rising levels of debt is a good thing in the long term. But it's hard to convey because it's not as graphic as, you know, the earthquake knocking down the building. But it's exactly the right thing to keep one's eyes on, that this is a Main Street issue. This will affect the livelihood, the living standards of the American people. It's not just a what happens to interest rates and how will Wall Street react kind of issue.
Thank you. The next question, I'll stay with Bill on this. As an expert in tax and budget policy issues, do you feel there is some general consensus among the economic community about steps that should be taken to reduce our long-term debt?
Wow. Everyone, right now there's not even agreement that it's a problem. there is a branch that includes some very respectable people like Paul Krugman and Larry Summers saying that we should basically ignore this issue right now and move on to other concerns. I feel like other concerns, like the current state of the economy, are extremely important, but I don't think that means we should therefore ignore the issue. In terms of consensus policies, you know, let me just say no. I mean, if there were, they would be being pushed. There's an hour conversation there, but I think at some level people know what we want to do on the tax system is reduce the amount of loopholes and try to reduce rates, but also raise revenue. And on the spending side, there's a notion that healthcare spending in particular needs to be reined in, but that's as far, I think, as the agreement goes. There's, yeah, let me just stop there.
I'm going to now throw this question at Paul with respect to the business community, recognizing, of course, that the business community, like the academic community, is not a monolith, but is there any coalescing around certain ideas in the business community?
Yeah, I think there has been, and you're right, it's not a monolith, there is divergence of view, but in general, I would say that the business community came at this with sort of a pragmatic approach. They come to Washington, they see it as sort of the necessary evil, they live in the world of creating jobs and business, and they have to get informed, so they come there, and they kind of pretty much figured that even though we might not like the way it works, sooner or later these guys get in a room and they'll sort something out and we'll live with it. We'll just find a way to live with it. That's been the general view. But I would say since August of 11, when the Speaker and the President were not able to come to agreement, that became a much more heightened sense of alarm that there was nobody run the trains, and to Bill's point, there was no agreement on anything. I would say that the business community universally believes that you need structural long-term reform in things like entitlements, or you put at risk the whole enterprise. To Bill's saying, this is the slow cancer eating at the future. I think they also universally agree that tax reform is critical, and by that they mean raising more revenue. They believe more taxes should be paid. Now, there's a lot of discussion around where the rates are and how you get rid of exemptions, but I can tell you, business spent a lot of years paying a lot of people on K Street to make sure that they got exemptions. Now, the corporate tax part of this is actually relatively small potatoes. I mean, I'm sitting next to the expert, he can tell you about it, compared to what's going on in individual taxes. But just to stay on business, the corporate tax rates are very high. You know, we're giving back $1.1 trillion in exemptions every year, you know, in taxes, and that's not good. And the business community pretty much, and this runs the gamut from, you know, the Larry Finks at BlackRock to the Fred Smiths at FedEx, have all said, you can take it all. You can have all the exemptions. Get rid of them. You know, what you're costing me in lack of productivity because of this uncertainty is so much more expensive than anything I'm going to lose on the exemptions. Just get it done. The uncertainty is what's killing the business guys. And I would say that's a very real issue, and there's probably more coalition. The other thing is I think the business community is a lot more alert to the damage of the political dynamic. So the business used to come to Washington and say, why don't you guys just sit in a room and fix it? We all know the answers. We know the answer. There are people who know how to fix Social Security, Medicare. They know how to do it. Well, why can't you do it? Well, politics is a very real thing. You know, Hubert Humphrey used to say that Washington is 26 square miles surrounded by reality. Well, you know, you come there and you talk to these people, but the reality for Dick Durbin and the reality for Saxby Chambliss and the reality for Mark Warner and the reality for a lot of these people, no matter how well-intentioned, is you've got people like Jim DeMint and the Club for Growth and the Heritage, and they're going to spend $5 million to beat you in a primary, and you better not talk about revenue. And that is a really ugly reality. So the business people were a little naive about that, right? So, oh gosh, that was it. Then we just drove them all out. Oh, there goes the Tea Party. Oh, no, sorry. Sorry. That's the Club for Growth. Stop them. But there are no innocents. And I would say that's the other part of this, is the business community realized, you know, they all had political action committees, and they weren't really paying attention to this. And now there's a lot more sensitivity to stop the K Street stuff. You better be at the table. 2, you better be talking to your political action committees, and you better be funding people who are out to fix the debt, not to kill any conversation, right? Because we come from a pragmatic, let's get together and compromise. I think that's a change. But I think there's a lot more savvy about this political reality is something you cannot just stand back and watch the crime happen. to Bill's point, this thing's coming. You can't just ignore it. Just because Krugman doesn't want to talk about it doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. And it doesn't mean there aren't other things. But all these things are sort of root cause. So gerrymandering, open primaries, judicial review of legislative districting, all these things are longer-term root cause issues to why it's so polarized and why Nate Silver has all those great statistics on congressional district by congressional district and these huge pluralities, and there are only 12 competitive districts, so nobody wants to have a conversation in Washington about the compromise. That's a real issue. And, you know, that's a change. You know, I mean, I think the statistic I heard from Jim Nussle was that, 55% of the House of Representatives has been there for 2 years or less. And many of the people who are complaining about the Health Care Act and trying to link it to the whole deficit, you know, the whole recent fight, they weren't even there when it was voted on. I mean, you know, they weren't even part of the process. So I would say business has been on a real learning curve, and there's a sense of you better engage. It's too critical, and it's become more of a citizenship issue than a Republican-Democrat business, not business issue.
Steve.
Let me just jump in a little bit. The question was, is there a consensus among policymakers? And I think within a certain realm, I think there is some of a consensus. Does that consensus extend across the political spectrum? No. But if you took Bill's group at Brookings and the Urban Institute and paired them with the American Enterprise Institute, sort of center-left, center-right, apologies, Bill, there would be tremendous agreement. And even during the last presidential campaign, you had ideas, for example, coming from Marty Feldstein saying, you know, who'd be on the right, Romney supporters, saying, well, let's put a total cap on itemized deductions. Now, you may quarrel with that, you may want to knock charity out of it and so forth, but that had a lot of support. On Social Security, there's agreement that among, again, this kind of consensus in the near middle of the road people, that, well, maybe you could change the formula to index and maybe not give as much great cost of living increases to the people who are wealthier, or maybe extend the age a little bit more. Similar things with Medicare. So I actually think so. And then if you look at the Bowles-Simpson, there were a lot of ideas in there. They didn't tackle health care, but there were a lot of interesting ideas in there that people could coalesce around. And so I think they're out there. I think there are books I think there are people sitting around Washington who can come up with these ideas. Making the transition in our current political system is very, very difficult for the reasons Paul just outlined. But I do think there are things you can do. It's also true that no one, I mean, there are some people who say we have to do this right now and make drastic changes. But I think most people recognize that when the economy is not growing very well, you can just phase these things in. And phasing them in will, as long as they're there, as long as you have a sense that the trajectory is going down, will do a lot of good. You don't have to make the drastic judgment right now. And I think what Krugman and maybe Larry Summers and some people, as they see people clamoring for deficit, thinking that it's going to make adjustments now. Or they could just be being contentious, I'm not sure. But either way, if you do these things gradually, I think you can actually make a lot of progress. And I do think people know what's there. That's not to say there's not ideological differences. So when Paul Ryan and Patty Murray come together and try to set deficit targets in the next month or so before December, I'm not very optimistic about that. I think actually the most likely outcome might be when we get to January, the Republicans just keep the government open, but they keep the sequester level down and continue that, what we all agree is kind of a silly policy, to take the part of the budget which is not growing faster and clamp it down more. But that's my thoughts.
Okay, and I'm going to throw this one again to Steve. With so little trust in government, how do you wean people from their expectations on entitlements and also deal with the aversion to individuals paying higher taxes?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that, but some poll results were shared with us from Washington, and it basically said that if you emphasize, for example, that these changes would come later, these changes to entitlements were coupled with other reforms, there was actually some political support for that. So at least that suggests to me that maybe it's not hopeless. But in terms of actual solutions, I'm not sure. I mean, Paul's more perhaps involved in working and talking to the politicians. Maybe he has some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, you know, I've given a lot of talks on this around the country, and I always get this question, you know, how did we get here? How on earth did this happen? I mean, how do I wake up every day and just in utter astonishment that this is like my government? And it acts like it's sort of like it was like divine intervention. Well, it wasn't. We all own it. Every one of all of us, we all own this. And there are lots of things that have contributed to it, because you've had a disposition that said you could sort of always have enough money to continue to spend down the road, and we'd sort of get away with it. Well, the jig is up, right? So there's sort of nowhere to hide anymore. And all the people that we are complaining about that are causing all the dysfunction, we put them there. I mean, it wasn't like China didn't put them there, you know, we put them there. So there's a little bit of this, when do we all sort of wake up and take ownership for our collective responsibility as citizens to be more engaged in understanding the issue? None of us get a free pass. Business certainly didn't. You know, we don't get a free pass. And so how do we all begin to realize that we have been part of the pathology that is creating this paralysis in our own, in the greatest political experiment in history? I mean, you know, you go back and read Federalist 10 by James Madison, and it just breaks your heart. He was talking about this in the 1770s. Well, it's sort of writ large. So I would say that the political reality is it's going to need more engagement, and we're going to need to have the political will to say you can't have it both ways. You can't just have an infinite sort of entitlement spending for the rest of time that eats up your entire economy, and you can't just tax everybody. Look, if you tax everybody in my bracket and everybody else in the world at 108%, you still don't pay for it. It's not just about raising the taxes. And even though a bunch of us in the business community were saying, look, I'll pay the 39.6, I don't care. Just fix the long-term code so that it's more rational. And then you've got the increasing issue of inequality in this country. I mean, the spending, you know, the income inequality is huge. It's a terrible problem. So we end up sort of mad at the system, but we don't take any ownership. And term limits have contributed to it. I mean, you know, I used to work in the Hill, and it wasn't just that every old committee chairman was a drunk idiot who should be thrown out. There are people who had a lot of institutional expertise, but if you've got all these new people who've been there 2 years and don't understand the rules, and we wonder why they don't get along and can't have a conversation, I mean, it's terrible. So, you know, there are many, many issues, but none of us gets a pass. You have to be engaged. Every one of us is a citizen. It's urgent. We owe it to our kids. Sorry, rant. It starts sounding like Dennis Miller, you know.
Your question was how do we essentially break the political logjam? I think events like what just happened the last couple of weeks ultimately will be helpful in breaking the political logjam. And that you saw the creditworthiness of the U.S. and the U.S. standing in the world economy basically held hostage by a minority of one of the political parties. And, you know, if the public and our elected officials can't learn from that episode, then we're going to be stuck with the system we have. But I'm optimistic that we can, that there are enough people that actually want to solve these problems and you know, help the economy and the American people, that they will learn from this episode and act accordingly in the future. I think the other thing that's generally important in all this is public education. It's very hard to, and let me be clear, public education about the options involved. It's very hard, it's very easy to put one's head in the sand and say, oh, I don't want to deal with this, you know, I don't want to have to face these ugly decisions about whether to raise taxes or cut people's health care. But I encourage you to actually think about them because they're very revealing. Once you realize that there has to be some solution, then you start comparing one solution to another rather than one proposed solution to the way things exist now. Because any solution is going to look worse than the way things exist now because the way things exist now is not sustainable. So there are going to be tax increases, there are going to be spending cuts, and the apples to apples comparison is one budget solution compared to another budget solution, not one budget solution compared to the tax and spending system we have now. So I don't see how we get there except by dumb luck unless there's more public education and more understanding of the trade-offs involved.
I would just add one comment on that. I think in the political narrative, we tend to trivialize the debate. You know, I'm the fat cat CEO who wants all my tax benefits and I'm going to throw grandma in the snow. Or I'm the guy who sold out the future of the country and I'm not a business, I'm not a true card-carrying businessman anymore because so, we tend to diminish our entire national conversation about this stuff. I think people are a lot smarter than that. And my own sense of traveling around the country is that most of the country is so sick of this, they are ready to just throw up. They can't stand it, and they know instinctively that this sort of trivialization and this extremism of the debate and these sort of gross generalized characterizations diminish the very conversation that Bill's talking about. So we never get to a more rational conversation. It isn't about throwing grandma in the snow and destroying Social Security, and it isn't about burning the government to the ground. It's not these crazy, nutty extremes. It's about real choices about our futures, and there are a lot of very well-intentioned people who've done a lot of great work to get to that. Bill's group, for sure, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, I mean, this information is there. It's a political climate that makes it so toxic, that makes it very hard. And I think that we own that as citizens. We have to give these people a pass and say, look, you get amnesty. Go do the right thing. We'll be with you. We trust you to do the right thing, and there is a balanced approach. That, I think, is a very troubling thing. We live by sort of news through advocacy. You sort of scan for your predisposition as opposed to really wanting to get at the real conversation. And that's disturbing. It says a lot about the country, and I can understand why people tune out. It just becomes noise.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if you look over the last 4 years and ask what were the two major policy initiatives that we'll look back at as being very important for our fiscal life going forward, one was after a couple of fits and starts, we basically extended most of the tax cuts from the early 2000s. Except for the high-income people. And we also fixed what was known as the alternative minimum tax, which was pushing middle-class people up into higher tax brackets. And so effectively, we froze in for all but the top income groups, the lower taxes that we had in 2000. That was sort of the cause of the problem to begin with. The other thing, of course, we did was we expanded health subsidies. For the middle class and through the uninsured through the Affordable Care Act. Now, we did raise some revenue with that, but my reading of the CBO numbers, and so that's probably a net drain. So if you look at our revealed preferences as a political system, we in fact exacerbated the situation over the last couple of years. And what we're saying today, to some degree, is, well, yeah, yes, we did that, but that has consequences that we're going to have to rethink exactly what we're doing, and we have to get people focused on that. And that's really hard because if our natural inclination as a political system was to keep those tax rates low and to take care of people who didn't have health insurance.
Okay, the next question I'm going to present, we've touched on it a little bit, but some economists say that we shouldn't do anything right now while the economy is fairly weak, and we should do it later. Is that feasible? Let me throw that out to Bill first.
It's not that we shouldn't do anything right now. It's that we should be stimulating the economy right now. The economy is not in good shape. The gap between what we're producing and what we could produce with full employment is extremely high by historical standards. And what you need to do to get the economy going in the short run is the opposite of what you need to do to bring the fiscal situation balanced in the long term. And that might seem a little strange, but there are lots of things in life like that. If you're kind of tired and sitting at your desk late in the afternoon and need a jolt of energy, nothing works as well as caffeine and sugar. Well, a few things work better, but let's stick with caffeine and sugar. But in the long run, a steady diet of caffeine and sugar is going to make you less healthy, not more healthy. And you need to do entirely different things like get rest and exercise and eat right and so on to generate energy in the long term. So right now, we should be stimulating the economy, not cutting back. We've cut back enormously in the last 2 or 3 years. And then that doesn't mean, though, that we can't be dealing with the long-term issues at the same time, especially because, as Steve mentioned, we need to phase these things in. Think about a carbon tax, for example. one of the main concerns of the carbon tax is going to hit the coal industry really hard. To be clear, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to get us to use less coal and more green energy, okay? But there's no reason that has to happen all at once. There's no reason you have to knock the daylights out of the coal industry in the next year to make that happen. You can phase in a carbon tax over 10 years. That gives the coal industry plenty of time to respond, to modify, to change. And in terms of global warming and in terms of revenue, it's much more important that we have the carbon tax in place and operational in 10 years than it is right now. And so we have plenty of time to phase in solutions, but we should be working on them now. We should be enacting them and implementing them over time. So let me just add one more thing to that. So the basic message is stimulate in the short term, consolidate in the long term. And let me just note, if you did both of those at the same time, you would make each of them more effective. Okay, so let's say you did a short-term stimulus and a long-term consolidation plan. That would be better than just a short-term stimulus. That would stimulate more in the short term because it would deal with this uncertainty that Paul talked about, that would give businesses more confidence that we were on a good path. So it would boost the stimulus effect. Likewise, the stimulus, by boosting the economy, would raise revenues and therefore help the long-term fiscal consolidation. So doing both of those at the same time would be better than doing either one, and doing either one would be better than what we're doing, which is nothing.
Yeah, and I would tell you, as the business community, you talked about what's the change in the business world. I completely concur with what Bill just talked about, 100%, and even as specifically as the issue around coal. And I'm an oil guy, so and I think that the oil, we're all guilty of this thing because a lot of the business community talks about what the announcement impact would be if the headline said, Boehner, Obama, McConnell, Reid, reach long-term fiscal stability for United States of America. Tax code has been massively reformed and will be stable for the next 10 years. We've actually begun slowly, not to blow up with an instant austere shock to the system, which would be terrible, but that we took a long-term responsible approach to this so that the trajectory, not for the next 10, but for the next 100 years, begins to stabilize. That sort of aha announcement moment would be a huge boom to business confidence. And I think it would do a lot for the GDP of this country. And I think it would do a lot to attract capital to the United States and invest here. And it would do a lot to sort of free up this sense of uncertainty that is in the business community. But there are all these issues, and I would say these issues tended to be historically very provincial. Coal industry doesn't want you to come, mess with me with a tax. Well, I would say that the broader business community is saying, look, there's plenty of subsidies and plenty of special deals that were going on in the coal industry for years, right? So we complain about solar, but my God, all sorts of favors were done for the coal industry. And by the way, most of the physical plant is 40 years old or older, and it's fallen apart. So the amount of capital, we talk about infrastructure investment and the stuff that we should be spending money on, we shouldn't be throwing it out the window in interest. We ought to be investing in long-term sustainable solutions that make the economy viable and competitive in the world. That's a comprehensive conversation. It's not a piecemeal, my little coal interest versus, it's the whole thing. And why aren't we having more of that conversation? And I would say business is learning how to do this better than we used to. And I think we need to be better at it because we should be thought leaders too. We should be leading this conversation about how to be having the broader conversation, not just sitting back saying it's my little interest versus you and I'm Exxon, so don't touch my investment tax credit, go ahead and pick on coal. I mean, that's silly, right? It's about the country. It's about the entire deal. And so I completely agree with what Bill said.
Let me just, I agree with almost all that was said, but let me just challenge Bill on one point. When we speak about policies and we advocate them, we assume that there's this kind of rational, reasonable government that's going to enact them. And then when we talk about the politics, we throw up our hands and say, it's crazy, it's nonsense, we have to have a radical change. So what I'm concerned about the following issue, that if you actually did say doing the following policy, which is to be stimulate now but kind of tighten later, whether that's really sustainable. So it's like going to New Orleans, you live in here, you say, well, I'm just going to go out to eat every night this week. But you know what? Next month I'll stop going to Commander's Palace, all right? And you sort of know that's not going to work because a month from now your friend's going to come up and say, hey, let's go to Commander's. The martinis are only 25 cents at lunch. right? And you'll end up going to Commander's Palace. And
You just won't make it out.
you just won't make it out. And so that's the worry I have here, which is that, yeah, from a theoretical point of view, I agree we have excess capacity in the economy, and the Fed is trying, of course, to stimulate the economy, but to do it with fiscal measures, which would actually make the deficit worse, would be harder to unwind in the future. And particularly in the current climate where we say, well, we're worried about the level of the debt, but now we say, well, we're not going to worry about it for the next 2 years because the economy is weak. Now, we did that during 2008-9, but I'm a little worried going forward that we really shouldn't be doing that right now. And it may be that's a price we have to pay for a government that can't chew gum and, and walk at the same time, but that might be the type of government we have.
In relation to this arena of issues, is there any lesson that can be learned from the recent austerity measures in Europe that is a lesson learned for this country, if anybody wants to take that?
Sure. In a weak economy, austerity doesn't work. As that happened, that's the lesson from the U.S. in the 30s. The Great Depression was actually 2 very big recessions with an enormous recovery in the middle of it. From 33 to 37, the economy grew like mad. And then in 37, we raised taxes and cut spending during the midst of a recovery. The economy was not back at full employment, and the economy plunged into recession again. The same thing happened in Japan in the 90s. They had a meltdown in 89, 90 that was kind of like what we had a couple years ago. By 95, 96, their economy was just getting back, going good again, and they raised taxes and cut spending and sent it back in a tailspin from which they still haven't really recovered. Europe in 2010, 2011, the austerity measures they did there in a short-term weak economy have been enormously counterproductive. The U.S. in the last 2 or 3 years has also followed austerity. If you look at what's happened to measures of the budget deficit that try to isolate the impact of policy. The budget deficit is affected by the economy, by interest rates, and by policy. If you look at measures of the budget deficit that try to isolate the effect of policy, policy's been very restrictive the last 2 or 3 years. Basically, since the stimulus in 2009 and 2010, we've cut back significantly, and most models suggest that that's one reason the recovery's been so weak. Is that the fiscal stimulus has been negative the last several years. So there's a time for austerity, but it's not when the output gap is 6% like it is now.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, so nothing revelatory to add. I mean, I'm a global business, so, I spend more time thinking about, what the UK Parliament does about, repatriation and tax policy is a lot more on my mind than how it compares to the United States and how does the United States maintain its competitiveness. But, when I look at Europe and, a few months back, and Bill, you probably saw, Financial Times has sort of buried on page 14 a little headline that says, balance sheet impairment on European banks, 3.4 trillion euro. And it's just sort of like ho-hum. I mean, Europe's got a long way to go. They got 10 years of hell ahead of them. And I think it's pretty evident that when the UK in particular slammed on the brakes and tried to do a lot of the stuff that Bowles-Simpson was talking about and sort of did it in 5 years, it was hugely disruptive. And that's why you hear guys like Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson saying it wasn't about slamming on the brakes. Now, that is the progressive narrative. That Erskine Bowles is out saying that the sky is going to fall if you don't fix this debt when what we need to do is grow and we got to get back to 2007. Well, go back to 2007, man. It was 40-to-1 leverage. What made Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers tick? 40-to-1. It's like the Persian cat, all that fur. Well, you throw water on the cat. Looks like the size of a gerbil, right? I mean, leverage was the fuel. Well, we're not going back to that, right? I don't think anybody wants to jump back into that. So the idea that we're just going to magically go back to 2007 growth with all that leverage, I don't think that's happening. So the reality is, I would share Bill's view that you need to have this sort of responsible balance of understanding that the deleveraging of the world economy after the shock was just unbelievable. It's hard to really get people to understand what that was about. And believe me, there were people in that time that were saying, we should just let AIG go under. Why are we paying $180 billion of government? Well, okay, what you don't understand is that in Germany, Deutsche Bank is leveraged 50 to 1. Now, by law, they can only be leveraged 10 to 1, but the other 40 to 1 was guaranteed by AIG credit default swaps, and you let AIG go, there goes the central bank of Germany. I mean, this was cataclysm. Right? So there are times, to Bill's point, where you got to do what you got to do, and it's a short-term thing. But it doesn't mean that we don't have enough knowledge about these longer-term structural tsunamis that are coming at us that we can't make intelligent choices about how to restructure them to make them solvent. I mean, Social Security is on a path to be insolvent in 20 years. That's just a fact. If we do nothing, that's happening. Medicare, 13. And what it means is that Paul Stebbins, who lives in Miami and New York, is going to have his Social Security cut by 25%, but so does the woman in, the Ninth Ward. Well, that's crazy. I mean, why aren't we having the conversation about how to fix that and make it more stable and more fair and more balanced? I mean, it seems to me we can do that. We're just not getting to it, and a lot of that is politics, and ultimately we own that, all of us. So anyway, that's my...
Okay, so if everyone, or a lot of people agree that the deficit and the debt, there are serious issues, how do we handle the fact that our two political parties have such different views on the size and the scope of government? How do we bridge that divide in a way that permits us to deal with this issue more constructively? Steve?
Well, I'll take I'll just take the first. Right. Well, part of it might be there's some optical things you can do. By optics, I mean policies that have one effect but look a different way. So, for example, Republicans generally are amenable to making higher income people pay more on Medicare. But they're not really willing to raise taxes to pay Medicare. So that's something that you could probably do. It's a budget savings either way. And so you have Medicare cost sharing. Now, historically, Democrats have been against sort of what we call means testing programs because they felt it would undercut the support of the programs for the middle class. That worry, is a 50-year-old worry in the U.S. And I think the programs are solid enough that we don't have to worry about that anymore. Another area where again where the optics might be important are some areas of tax expenditures, and Bill's a real, of course, expert on this. But there are certain tax expenditures or programs, essentially tax breaks that effectively serve like government programs, but they happen to be not explicitly appropriated by Congress or work through spending, but they work through the tax system. And so if you cut those back, they don't look like tax increases. They don't look as much like spending cuts, and so both parties can kind of coalesce around those. So those are some of the things, and some of those were in the Bowles, Simpson, and other plans. And if you do it that way, then certainly at least a group in the middle, not the crazies on both ends, but a group in the middle, and moving a little bit further out that could maybe cohere to those policies.
Bill?
Yeah. So it's a great question. How do we manage this politically? And let me just say at the outset, I yield to no one in my cynicism about the short-term politics of this stuff. I see it up close every day. At the same time, for some reason, I'm a long-term optimist. Like, I come out of the episode that we just had, I think there's a line in the movie Jerry Maguire, not the show me the money line, but there's a different line where I think Cuba Gooding says to Tom Cruise, you think we're having an argument, I think we just started talking. All right? And that's kind of how I feel about all this, is that these are really tough issues. We are a loud, noisy, boisterous nation where everybody has an opinion, regardless of whether they know anything about the topic or not, sometimes inversely related to whether they know anything about the topic or not. I guarantee you that if you went back and looked at the transcripts of civil rights debates in the 1950s and 60s, that they were far uglier than anything that's going on now. We had an experience with gay marriage as a country the last few years where the tide seems to have turned. Again, there's a big, vociferous debate with incredibly strongly held views And you can see the tide turning there. You can see that in 20 years that's not going to be an issue. And I feel like a lot of this, it comes back to public education and airing of views. And, you know, this is just how we do things. We're like I said, we're a loud, boisterous country. People, this is how we work through things as a country. This is how we've always done it. You know, you wish you could, you know, it'd be nice if everyone just got to the answer, which, parentheses, happens to be my answer, close parentheses, immediately, but that's just not how we do things. And so I don't view the ferocity of the debate as a negative. I actually view it as a positive because it suggests to me that people are moving beyond the denial stage, if you will, and moving into sort of thinking seriously about how to address these issues. And you can interpret the Tea Party's sort of rabid opposition to Obamacare, for example, as them viewing it as almost an existential threat to their existence, right? Now, so that explains the extremeness of their responses. But the neat thing is they're actually focusing on the policy, thinking about the implications, worried about the implications. You know, I hate to say it, but that's how the system is supposed to work. You know, we're supposed to express opinions and mix it up in the public marketplace of ideas, blah, 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 and eventually, you know, some solutions come out the other side. But that's how we've always done things in this country.
I'd say one of the things that got me very interested about Fix the Debt as an organization was that, you know, it wasn't a short-term fixed deal. I mean, this thing is, we got here over a long period of time. This didn't happen in 10 minutes. This is 50 years of policy. So, you know, you don't just wake up one day and say, oh my God, it's all screwed up. I mean, gee, we can't get along. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to this issue, and I think that it starts with having a national conversation. Most of our nation doesn't even have, we don't even have the words to talk about it. Most people are sort of, you know, 17 trillion, what are you talking about? You know, I'm busy trying to get a job. Someone in my family just lost a job. My kid can't get a job. My grandmother's living at home. You know, the economy's tough. And you want me to talk about 17 trillion and all these idiots fighting in Washington? I mean, you know, it's a very frustrating thing. And it's sort of saying, I don't have any space in my head to be thinking about this insanity. But I would say that longer term, the reason Fix the Debt wasn't just about the inside baseball of, you know, what are we going to do in the Reconciliation Committee and what happens when Patty Murray and Paul Ryan duke it out over Social Security. That's one part of it, but the other is the reason Fix the Debt has 50 state organizations and why it has steering committees and why it has a huge citizen outreach group is to start having a better national conversation, to Bill's point. It is public education. We become a lot less tolerant if we don't just buy into the sort of the simplistic extremist views of how this reductionism. I think we end up, you know, as a collective country, I think we're a lot smarter than people give us credit for, and I think we can get to the right answers, and people want to get there. So let's try to make that happen. That's my view.
And that leads to my last question, then we'll open the floor up for questions from the audience. And this is a tough one, but following up on what you just said, Paul, what can people do as citizens that will help motivate political leaders to squarely address this issue going forward? What can individuals do to ensure our political leaders take this issue seriously?
Well, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. You know, having met and spent time with many of these political animals, you would be amazed if you wander around Capitol Hill, and I'm sure Bill and Steve, you've probably done it too, but there are some really well-intentioned people who are trying really hard to get to the right thing. And I tell you, they pay attention to letters and phone calls. They don't pay attention when the bag full of automatically produced, you know, union postcards show up in a big bag on their desk on some issue. That goes right in the trash. But phone calls from citizens in their district, when they come home and have conversations at town halls and at Chamber of Commerce meetings and local community centers and at universities, and they hear people saying, what are you doing about my future and what are you doing about the debt? I don't pretend to know every single issue, but I want you to get to yes. That's an important message to hear. It's an important message to hear. And I think right now the cynicism is, I can't get my head around all this. It's way too ugly. I'm just going to sort of check out. That doesn't help, I would say. So I would say it's a higher call to duty. You got to engage. And they do respond. Politicians do respond, because I can tell you one thing that's very much on their mind is re-election. They think about that a lot, which is why, I mean, look, I mean, think about it. When all the stuff was going on in Syria, whether you want to warn Syria or not is not the point, but everybody was deciding Syria based on phone call polls. I mean, you know, we're deciding sort of matters of war on public opinion. I would have thought, you know, I don't know whether everybody in this room knows the phone number of your senator or congressman. Call it someday and say, I live here in New Orleans and I'm ticked off. I don't like it. Please, you know, do something rational to fix it. I think that helps. It does have an impact.
Bill?
Better yet, tweet. Congressional offices follow their Twitter mentions and hashtags fairly closely. As someone told me a couple of days ago, that they pay more attention to that than almost anything else. I don't have great advice on how to change the system. I mean, the way I chose was to get a degree in economics and work on the economics of the issues and try to communicate that. Some days I think that's a brilliant idea, and some days I don't. But everyone has to, you know, pick their own level. We all have busy lives. We all have things we want to do. Besides, believe it or not, think about the public debt. There's no substitute for understanding the issues. And so if there's, that seems to me to be the single thing that I would emphasize, is that these issues, in some ways, they're really simple. We have to close this gap. In some ways, they're really complicated. There are lots of ways to close the gap, and they have interactions, and they have, you know, trade-offs involved. But there's no substitute for understanding the issues.
I just add that in Louisiana, of all places, might be a good example of what can be done. Louisiana has a number of organizations which historically it was the business community that was the pro-reform party in Louisiana. And so these business-backed organizations like, for example, the Public Affairs Research Council, help actually develop policies, give unbiased analysis about fiscal matters and so forth. And last year when we had the debate about what to do about the state income tax, whether to abolish income tax and move to more sales taxes, there was the business community through the Public Affairs Research Council, through its other groups, kind of weighed in. And so, to some extent, to fix a debt and the business people like Paul getting involved, I think is a good thing to get them more involved with Washington and not leave Washington just by itself. Although I think Bill could handle them a little bit, he needs some help from the outside.
I mean, that's certainly why the business people got involved, because, again, I think there was a sense that it's a higher duty of care. You know, it's like the old thing in New York. You hear someone screaming outside. Do you just turn your back and shut the door? Do you actually get involved? And I think for the business people, it really became more of a, and I know it sounds corny, but it's true, it's more of a citizenship issue. You can't have the exposure that many of us have to the world. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. I didn't, you know, it wasn't like I just went up some corporate thing. I started this company when I was in my 20s. I mean, I got rejected by business school twice and started a business. So, you know, but having done that, that's an amazing set of experiences, right? And now I'm a Fortune 74 company. Well, I've learned a lot in doing that. But I have learned that this is an amazing country and that we have an extraordinary role in the world. And to just sit back and sort of say, well, you know what, that's going to be someone else's issue, and I'm going to be, you know, living in the Hamptons and not worried about it. I just don't buy that. And for the youth of this generation, I mean, I've got a 27-year-old son and twin daughters who are 25, and you know, they're looking at me and saying, you know, Dad, what on earth are you people doing? You know, and so Twitter. I mean, look, we could start a revolution in Egypt. We can't talk about our debt. I mean, come on, you guys. I mean, it just seems to me. You just can't not, once you know about this, and I think Bill's the same way, you pick your channel. I mean, mine was through the Business Roundtable, but once you start knowing about it, you can't unknow this. You can't just pretend you didn't see it. And I think that was Dave Cody who came back from the Bowles-Simpson Commission and said, hey guys, you can't unknow this now. Now that you do know it, you sort of have a moral responsibility. So, whatever.
Thank you.